Well, we've certainly reached critical mass, so let's start. Delighted to have everybody with us today for a conversation with four governors to talk about how their respective states have been affected by the downturn in U.S. China relations and how subnational engagement can be used to get the relationship on a more stable footing. I should start by saying, if you don't know me, I'm Steve Orleans, and I'm president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Let me start off just by giving you a quick background as to how this program came together. At the end of this summer, Bob Holden, former governor of Missouri and founder and chair of the United States Heartland China Association, called to discuss the current state of U.S. China relations and how the Heartland China Association could work with the National Committee on dealing with these issues. We came to the conclusion that our two organizations should jointly organize a virtual roundtable where former governors could share their concerns. A month later, we held a thoughtful and wide-ranging 2-hour discussion with 10 former governors, evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. We all agreed that it would be important to share their very interesting views with the public. So today, we're going to hear from 4 of those governors who had participated in that meeting. They need no introduction. In fact, if I introduced them, we would have no time for the program, but just to say that they are all incredible public servants to this country. Bob is chair, as I said before, of the U.S. Heartland China Association, was governor of Missouri from 2001 to 2005. Jon Huntsman has served as ambassador to Singapore, China, and most recently Russia, and was governor of Utah from 2005 to 2009. He also serves on the board of directors of the National Committee. Gary Locke is currently interim president of Bellevue College. He served as U.S. ambassador to China from 2011 to 2014, and prior to that as Secretary of Commerce and governor of Washington from 1997 to 2005. He was the first, I should know, Chinese American to hold all 3 of those positions. He also serves on the board of the National Committee. And last but certainly not least is Rick Snyder, governor of Michigan from 2011 to 2009. During his term, he led 8 trade missions to China, which resulted in an exponential increase of Chinese FDI into Michigan. Just for the record, the other governors who participated in our roundtable were Tom Kean of New Jersey, Ronnie Musgrove of Mississippi, Ed Schaefer of North Dakota, Ted Strickland of Ohio, and Tom Vilsack from Iowa. In this program, each of the governors will speak for about 5 minutes on how the downturn in relations has affected the state. We'll then have a discussion and then take audience discussions. Let me now turn it over to Governor Holden to hear about Missouri and the Heartland region, and to thank you, Bob, for co-hosting this event with us.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that very kind introduction, and Jan and all the staff. I very much appreciate getting together again. I'll talk about Missouri and the Heartland region and our organization, but just kind of give a little bit of background to the audience. I come from a small rural community, graduating a class of 25 from high school. In fact, I started out in a one-room schoolhouse. Went on to college from there and then got elected governor of the state of Missouri. While I was governor, I also served as chairman of the Midwest Governors Association. And at that point in time, saw a lot of our manufacturing, particularly in some agriculture, leaving the state of Missouri, going overseas. And I started thinking about how the Missouri could get re-engaged again. And I came to the conclusion that a good opportunity would be to develop those relationships with China. And so I made my first trip to China, announced Missouri was going to have an office in China. And from there, we expanded out and developed some very, very good contacts. I, as I said, come from the heartland of the United States. Where our organization is a 501c3 organization, not for profit, 20 states from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. We work with governors, with mayors, with business leaders, with the community leaders, cultural activity, educational institutions. These 20 states, all the way from the Great Lakes to the Gulf, is what we call the heartland of the United States. And I would always tell audiences, if you really want to understand the United States, understand what is going on in the heartland. And I still hold true to that today. Our focus is in 3 areas: working with cultural relationships, educational relationships, and business ties. Today, Steve asked me to touch a little bit on agriculture. What most people probably don't realize, of the top 15 states in the United States in terms of agricultural production, 13 of them come out of this heartland region, 13 of the 15. We are a rural leader in agriculture. For every $1 billion in sales, that creates over 6,800 new jobs in our part of the country. China has been the largest purchaser of our agricultural products, and we want to maintain that and keep it growing. Our farm economy, our communities depend on a global exchange of product and money to grow and be prosperous in the years ahead. It really provides the important aspect of our whole economy. It feeds our infrastructure. It supports our colleges and universities. It supports, of course, our businesses. So we are tied to a global economy. And we as a region and as a country, I think, want to make sure that we build those relationships going forward.
Terrific, Bob. John, give us an overview from the perspective in Utah.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you and the National Committee, and thank you for the good work that you do in bringing people together and promoting greater understanding. I'm delighted to be here with colleagues, both Republican and Democrat. I think it's important for discussions like this that we get right to the bottom line of the importance of the U.S. China relationship, which is really based on, or should be based on, solid people-to-people ties, which are forged through any number of means. But as governor, you can't help but reflect on your state's future, the future of your state's population, and how best to prepare them for the challenges and opportunities going forward. And it was very clear after I had been elected governor that China would be a very important and central part of our economic relationship going forward, our people-to-people, our educational opportunities going both ways. And I made it a point to identify and work with China in areas where we found mutual benefit, where we were able to build bridges that would serve the needs of future Utahns. So if you stop to conclude that the U.S.-China relationship will really define the last half of the 21st century, we've got a lot of work ahead of us if we're going to maintain the kind of relationship that allows us both to solve problems, to be honest in describing what our differences are, but also to engage where we have some natural opportunities to strengthen bonds. In Utah, it was pretty apparent that trade, particularly in areas like agriculture and technology, would be a prominent part of our future. Clearly, the downturn in the relationship will impact our trading opportunities. We've got a lot of farmers and ranchers who have built up market opportunities, who have built bridges between the United States and China. They grow great products. and they've developed market share. It would be a bad thing if that was jeopardized going forward based on a deteriorating relationship. But I think we have to prepare for any eventuality on the economic side. On tourism, which for those of you who have been to the great state of Utah, you know of its natural beauty, 5 national parks, and the desire that many people have in all corners of the world to visit this lovely destination. We made tourism a priority. In fact, I went over to China on one trade mission and actually spoke to some of the leading organizations involved in tourism. I sold our state. I told them of the lovely destinations, and we've had an uptick, I'd say in the last 10 to 15 years in the area of tourism. Why that's important to the people of Utah, and I think to people all over the United States, is there's a very unique economic multiplier effect that exists for every tourist that comes into our state. Not only do they leave with a great appreciation of the American West, having met Americans along the way, but they leave money behind. And that economic multiplier effect is a very important one from a travel and tourism standpoint. And we have noticed that the numbers of tourists, not just because of COVID-19, but also because of the current nature and challenges of the U.S. China relationship have been diminished. Finally, let me just say that the people-to-people aspect of the relationship is probably the most important aspect to me. And one that we must work very hard to preserve, even during moments of challenge and difficulty. Because it's through people-to-people interaction that we begin to better understand one another. We're able to problem solve in areas based on that understanding, and it keeps us out of trouble. We did a very unique thing in our public schools in Utah when we introduced Mandarin language immersion programs, which today in Utah constitutes the largest such program in the United States. And the reason I felt that that was important is exactly because through language, you're able to better understand and decipher a different culture. And that brings people closer together. So in the years ahead, no doubt, the people-to-people investment will be absolutely critical in getting toward greater problem solving between the United States and China. So just a couple of thoughts there, Steve. I had a couple of other ideas. Maybe we can hit them later on areas where we can actually work together. So thank you for allowing me to participate.
Great. Happy to have you. Gary.
Well, thanks a lot, Steve, for inviting us. And it's really great to be on the panel again with great friends of mine. And, you know, we all have different states and have different perspectives, but I think we have a common appreciation and understanding of the need for job creation, whether it's agricultural, industrial, to services, and even tourism. When I was at the Commerce Department as secretary, we had a motto: the more that we export, the more our companies produce. The more that we produce, the more workers we need. And those are good paying jobs, whether it's farming, food processing, manufacturing, exports. And tourism, of course, is considered an export. It's really sale of American products and services to foreigners who are supplying money and paying for those products and services. The transaction may actually occur in America, but it's the same. It's the purchase of American goods, products and services by people outside the United States. Our state is heavily dependent on trade. 1 out of every 3 to 4 jobs in the state of Washington is directly or indirectly tied to trade, both imports and exports. And certainly over the last several years with the trade war between the United States and China, we have really felt that drop in exports, from our cherries to our apples to our wheat to Boeing airplanes, and the list goes on and on. Our exports are down almost 65% from the pre-trade war levels. And just imports and exports between our ports, involving just not the state of Washington, but the Pacific Northwest, Oregon and Washington, are down 60%, imports and exports. So this is really having a big impact on our jobs here in the state of Washington. Our ports alone account for some almost, about 100,000 jobs directly tied in terms of handling cargo in the state of Washington in just the year 2019. And that was already with some of the effects of the trade war. Boeing has not sold an airplane to China at all in the years of 2018 and 2019, or even any parts of 2020. Now that's even before the problems with the MAX 737 and the crashes and the suspension of orders for that. While there were no tariffs imposed on Boeing airplanes, it was basically an implicit retaliation for the tariffs that the United States imposed on China. So this is very, very significant. And we were also seeing the drop in international students coming to our colleges and universities. Part of it is, of course, and most of our international students come from Asia and especially China. When the embassies are closed, when the policies are to say that all Chinese students are in effect spies for the Chinese government, even if they're here to study art, literature, that reluctance or animosity toward the students from China is not helping. And of course, the COVID-19 environment is hurting international students from all parts of the world when they think that the United States is not a safe place to be residing in, or certainly not to study. So we have very serious problems with the trade war because it really has not only affected our exports, but it's also raised the cost of doing business for businesses in the state of Washington. When the components that you are buying from China are now much more expensive due to the trade war, the tariffs, that makes the ultimate cost of that product manufactured in the state of Washington or anywhere in the United States much more expensive. And then it puts those US companies, producers, manufacturers at a competitive disadvantage when they're trying to compete against, let's say, the finished product from China or finished products from elsewhere around the world. And then, of course, there's a huge impact on the American consumer. Even before the height of the trade war and the tariffs imposed by the administration on Chinese goods, I think the New York Fed and Wall Street Journal and other publications indicated or estimated that the average impact on American households was about $600 to $800 more per year for all the various goods and items that they might be buying, whether at Walmart, Target, Nordstrom, Home Depot, you name it. The impact of the tariffs was increasing the cost of American goods that families purchase every year. At the same time, we're seeing that the tariffs on American goods was making products from other parts of the world much cheaper relatively in China. So the American product that goes into China with a retaliatory tariff was making that American product much more expensive compared to, let's say, the French or German or British or Canadian product, and was hurting US companies. And while many of these countries have similar concerns about the economic and trade policies of China, are going at it alone strategy was actually helping the companies and the competitors of American companies, but these are foreign competitors, whether they're in Europe or other parts of the world. And so this trade policy, this trade war, certainly has affected our jobs here at home, but has also affected our American consumers and everyday households.
Do you know, Gary, if Airbus was selling while Boeing's, sales fell off a cliff, was Airbus selling at the same time to China?
They may not have been selling very many, but they're definitely selling, because Boeing has not registered a single sale since the beginning of 2018.
Right. And a 65% drop, I assume a big percentage of that is Boeing aircraft.
A big part is Boeing airplanes, but also our agricultural goods. We were actually shipping fresh cherries to China. And these are all pre-ordered items, and so there was no spoilage, and the farmers were doing quite well. Actually, 747 cargo loads, mini plane loads of fresh cherries going to China. All of that virtually eliminated.
Wow. Governor Snyder.
Well, it's great to be with you, Steve, and my colleagues and the people watching this. So let me share a few thoughts from a Michigan perspective, and then a couple things that we kind of specialize in our state, particularly on the manufacturing front. Given a little background, as 2008 to 2010 was a depression in Michigan, where it was a recession in most of the rest of the country. We lost more jobs than any other state. And that's what drove me to run for governor, was to reinvent Michigan and to say we had to do things a new and different way. And I was fortunate enough to get elected. So the role is how do you bring back jobs to a state? We were 50 out of 50 for job creation, and we got back to being a top 10 state in that time frame. And one of the key ways to do it was to go to China, is to recognize we're part of a global economy. We're a manufacturing powerhouse. We're actually very strong in agricultural products. We're the second most diverse agricultural state in the nation. And to do that, you have to trade. And so it was important to me to go to China, which politically was something that most people looked down on originally, because with the manufacturing job loss, many people blame China for that, where the greatest cause was productivity increases in the US. So I went about going to China, and it was successful. Built a lot of great people relationships, a lot of other great relationships. And so we became a leader in terms of direct investment coming into our state, creating jobs for Michiganders. And to go to Gary's point, we also sold a lot of great agricultural products to China. One of the other things is we've got fabulous universities here. And we had a lot of Chinese students going to our institutions and still do. But one of the things I would mention on the higher ed side is the big drop in higher ed that we've seen. Just picking two of our biggest institutions, which would be University of Michigan and Michigan State University. In the fall of 2018, we had over 7,000 Chinese students just at those two institutions. By fall of 2020, this last year, that number had dropped below 6,000. It had dropped 16% in the course of 2 years. That's scary, folks, in terms of what it can do to our educational institutions, in terms of their ability to survive, to keep going during this difficult time. Because again, they tend to be the best paying students. The other thing is the whole academic environment. There has been a need to do more to look for challenges in our educational system on the research side, and there's been a crackdown on the Chinese researchers, which is not a good thing in many respects. I mean, some of it is important to national security. So it's a careful balance that needs to be done there. And I think it's creating an environment, though, that's created a negative environment more than a positive one. The other issue is we've actually seen it with Chinese students worried about what China's been doing with respect to how they've been handling students here. The anti-subversion laws in Hong Kong have actually had a negative effect on Chinese students wanting to be in our institutions here. They're afraid what they may say in a classroom may get back to China and create issues for their family. So both from a US government side and a Chinese government side, they've seen interests that cause them to do things in the academic environment that have made it more difficult to be a student coming into this country from China. And we need to work through those kind of issues and find a better environment for that. On the manufacturing front, obviously it's been a challenge with COVID and everything else. There's been a slowdown, but before that even happened, though, the tariffs had a negative impact in terms of making it difficult to do business between the two countries, which cost jobs on both sides. One of the things that really disturbed me was how the tariffs were actually applied. One of the tariffs, in fact, were on capital goods, where literally we had companies wanting to come set up businesses in Michigan, set up factories in Michigan to hire Michiganders. But they put tariffs on the capital equipment, so it wasn't affordable to bring the equipment to our country. So it continued to be an import item to us instead of a American manufactured good. We need to be smarter about how we do these things. Again, we all need to understand there are national interests, there are important security interests, there are intellectual property interests, but we need to be doing something other than broad brush strokes that create unintended consequences that are very negative for Americans having jobs, Americans learning at educational institutions, and us learning from one another. Because I think it's critically important, and I found this from my personal experiences, that it's not just about business, it's not just about jobs, but it's about people relationships and how we've done this in every area, from cultural affairs to agricultural things to tourism to the great areas these my colleagues have talked about. We need to encourage it in all fronts, and I think one of the best ways to do it is at the subnational level. Federal governments will have their issues, but let's keep doing better things than what we've seen over the recent month or few months and last year or two because of COVID. As we come out of this and get vaccines, let's figure out how to work together and to do more, because the more we do together, the safer the world's going to be.
Fabulous introductions, really. Those were terrific. Do you think, are you reflective, the four of you, are you reflective of all governors? Is this just a, you know, your job is not to worry as much about national security as the federal government. So Secretary Pompeo, in talking to the National Governors Association, you know, warned governors against doing too much with China. So are the four of you kind of reflective of kind of the 50 sitting governors? And well, I guess first that question, whomever wants to answer that can do it.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. I would say generally, yes. I think not across the board in every case, but 2 or 3 attributes of governors. And I love being a governor because of part of it was hanging out with all these guys and the peers that we had in those days, is you find that governors tend to be less partisan when it comes to running a state. You're responsible for running a state, and you tend to get along with people better. You know you're competing. I competed with these guys too, but we had relationships. If you needed problems and help, you could talk to one another and you'd do things. And you'd also look at what's good for your state, which was to do business across the globe. And I think generally governors recognize that. And we would go out of our way, and many governors made trade missions to China. Not as many as some of us, but they made missions there. So what I would say is you probably have someone on the extreme of being probably much more proactive, but as a whole, I would say governors are much better about building relationships, particularly with China and other places, than a lot of the federal government side might be.
I would agree with that.
Obviously, you know, we have to be cognizant of the national security interest and issues raised by Washington, D.C. But you know, we're not engaging in national security issues if you're just helping our farmers and our manufacturers sell their made in USA goods and products into China and the rest of the world. That's what governors are for. We're really supposed to be watching out for the welfare of our people in terms of jobs, education, a safety net. And the more we can help our folks sell their stuff, the more they're going to produce and the more jobs they're going to create. And these are good paying jobs. So I think that the governors are going to have to continue to do this because China has enormous needs, whether it's feeding its people, to cleaning up the environment, to raising the standard of living within the countryside. And so much of what we do and make and produce in America can help the Chinese people achieve those aspirations and those dreams. That's a win-win. And we can leave, you know, Beijing and DC to work out some of the security issues on their own. And obviously we need to press China to improve their protection of intellectual property and the rule of law. But as many of my colleagues indicated, the more that there's interaction between the two peoples, the more there's understanding, recognition, and perhaps more support for human rights and democracy and some of the freedoms and the liberties and the diversity that we embrace here in the United States. And maybe some of that will hasten the development and the opening of China.
Jon, you want to take on that? Or Bob? Sorry.
No.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Steve, when you strip politics out of the U.S. China relationship, you're left with 2 great nations trying to figure out how to get along, how to trade, how to solve tensions in the security realm, how to exchange people back and forth. And there's no more exciting a job when it comes to problem solving and trying to do good for your people than being governor. It's pretty much stripped clear of politics, and what are you left with? You're left with a balance sheet that you've got to make work. You've got entrepreneurs, you've got businesses, you've got education bills, you've got healthcare bills, And every governor comes to find when they look at their balance sheet that one of their greatest trading partners, if not number one, is China. And this came out of, nowhere. So if I looked at Utah's top trading partners over the last 20 years, 20 years ago, China would not have been anywhere in the top 10 or 20. Today, and I suspect every state is the same, it's in the top 3, if not number 1. So that naturally takes you to, as you're trying to promote exports and economic activity in your state, which is a big thing that governors do. And you do that because you want to pay the bills. You want your businesses to be prosperous. That naturally takes you to China. And that's why all of us here, and probably most other governors, have done trade missions to China. And an interesting thing happens when you sit in China with provincial governors. You get out of Beijing, you get out of the politics of Beijing, which kind of has like the politics of Washington. You sit down and you talk to provincial governors, and you have a very common conversation. You talk about healthcare, you talk about jobs, you talk about schools, and it's really interesting. And so this kind of gave rise to at least some of my early thinking about a subnational approach. So if we can get provincial governors and state governors together, free and clear of politics, just to try to figure out how best to make connections that really do serve the interest longer term of both countries, that's what we ought to be focused on. So leaving this in the hands of governors, I think is a really important thing, because it really does strip it free and clear of a lot of unnecessary politics.
Wow.
Last year, before COVID hit, we took a delegation of mayors from cities to China, and none of them had ever been to China before in their life. Didn't know what to expect. In fact, they kind of indicated they sure didn't want people to know that they were making a trip to China. But we went, and to a person, every single one of them came back and said, "This is a whole different world about China than we expected it to be." It's not that we agree with each other on all the issues, but at least it's the human aspect of it. When I was, after I left office, myself and Kip Bond made trips together to China. Matt Blunt is one of our strategic advisors, and Roy Blunt is a longtime friend of mine. We're of different political parties, but as all the other governors have said, governors and people at the governor level and the mayor's level have to find solutions to be successful. And so I think all of us reach out much better at our level than sometimes they do at the national level.
Yeah, I went to the Heartland, Bob, to Peoria, Illinois, at the request of Darren LaHood, and spoke there, and half the audience was soybean farmers and half were Caterpillar folks. So at the end of it, a couple walked up to me, and I said, and they were soybean farmers. I said, "How's life?" He said, "It's difficult. We're not shipping," this is pre-COVID, "we're not shipping our soybeans to China. They're sitting in a silo. I need to pay the interest on the loan for the crop, and I need to pay for the electricity to keep the fan going, to keep the soybeans dry so they don't rot." And I said, "Oh, so what do you think of the tariffs?" And he said, "The Chinese deserved it."
Yeah, that's part of a problem.
It was quite a statement. I mean, it really was eye-opening. Clearly not in his economic interest, but he felt the Chinese deserved it. So my question really is, should governors, both you and the sitting governors, be advocating for an ending of the tariffs that were put in place since January 20th, 2017?
I think the governors need to emphasize to all the policymakers in Washington, D.C., first of all, the economic impact of the tariffs on their companies and on their consumers, and hope that the administration, the incoming administration, will devise a more effective strategy to combat and address the very real, very serious economic and trade policies that China has been engaging in that are contrary to their commitments in terms of the international trading system and their accession to the WTO. Obviously, the United States companies and our government have deep concerns about the unfair trade and economic policies of China. But the trade war is, I think, the wrong way to approach it. And we need to be working with our allies and countries that all around the world who have similar concerns with China's policies. But our allies and their companies are actually benefiting from the trade war because they're not seeing tariffs on their products, which makes that German widget, Canadian widget, much cheaper in comparison to the American widget when we're trying to sell that into China.
Right, we're effectively creating trade diversion. So the China's getting the goods, they're just getting them from somebody else at a cheaper price. So that's clearly right. Others think that we should call for a rollback and ask sitting governors to do that. And the second part of that question is, did China ever play in your governor's election, in your election as governor?
Not that I'm aware of. And I didn't, seek that support. But I mean, I think that we need to roll back the tariffs, because what most people don't fully understand is when they buy our product, it not only helps, say, the soybean provider, but it also puts money into our schools, it puts money into our infrastructure, it puts money into our technology, it puts money in all aspects of our economy because of their participation.
Steve, I think that governors can play an important role when it comes to informing Washington policymakers about economic impact on their state and on the region. Oftentimes, governors are closer, which is interesting because governors really don't have a foreign policy portfolio to speak of. I mean, that really constitutionally is a federal prerogative. But I think we have an important role to play when it comes to keeping members of Congress briefed on what their choices and decisions are having, the impact at a local level. I think that is absolutely correct. But it's also true that that governors, as they work with provincial governors, not only are you getting to know each other, not only you're learning more about the other culture and how other communities function, but they're also learning a lot about advancements that we have made. For example, intellectual property protection came up a moment ago, and that's probably the most pernicious issue we have in our trading discussions right now, and one that's really going to have to be dealt with over time. And I'm convinced it won't be until local Chinese entrepreneurs feel they have a stake in the outcome that they'll put pressure of their own on Chinese decision makers. But as governor, I found I'd be interested in hearing from my colleagues that intellectual property protection, particularly in a state like Utah, where there's a heavy technology base, really was the foremost concern. I mean, tariffs are absolutely there. Tariffs on a standalone basis are not a long-term solution. They have to be part of a larger trade strategy. But intellectual property theft really has been, I think, the greatest concern among entrepreneurs and certainly the tech sector in our state. And this is one where interaction between states and provinces and the kind of pressure that provinces can put on the central government, ultimately, I think is going to be an important part of fixing it. But I think this remains really one of the biggest trade issues that we have between us, and not an easy one to fix.
Yeah, just to reinforce a number of the comments that have already been made, I think it's appropriate that a lot of the tariffs get rolled back. I'm not sure they achieved the objective that people thought they were intended to do to begin with as a practical matter. It was much like taking a shotgun to deal with approaches you need a rifle for, which is to deal with the issues that Governor Huntsman just talked about, in particular, intellectual property protection. When you talk about all these things, you have to acknowledge there are real issues that we need to solve with China. We need to have better intellectual property protection. We need to have a better investment environment in terms of a fair level playing field there. The tariffs themselves didn't help solve those problems. We were already getting companies setting up in the US because it was economic rational to be here instead of being in China from a competition point of view in a global marketplace. The agricultural items, all we did was hurt American farmers and American consumers. So it's really figuring out how do we put policies in place to address the problems rather than saying, throw a broad brush approach at something saying, well, this will help get them to the table to solve it. Well, we created a lot of other issues that weren't really central to the issue that we need to deal with the most.
Should governors that Governor Snyder, that raised the question, should governors be advocating a bilateral investment treaty between the United States and China, where kind of job creating investments, not investments in the national security area, but investments in Michigan and Ohio and in a lot of the kind of Rust Belt areas would be enhanced?
Well, I'm not sure it'd just be bilateral. I mean, that's the case where we actually pulled out of some negotiations to do things with all of Asia. Because again, I think one of the strengths that America should always be emphasizing is we don't need to be on our own. We should actually be trying to figure out how to broaden the base of allies we're working with and to do things in a collaborative fashion. I think that's where leadership really comes in. And I think it's going back to the original point about how governors can do that. Look at the pool that our country's drawn on to find ambassadors to China. It's governors like these two great guys we got here, and we've had a couple others do that job. So it's pretty cool to see the need to do that, but I would encourage more multinational work as much as bilateral work.
Yeah. This one's kind of for Gary. I guess I think it's clear to people, in the States that the investment creates jobs. It's clear that exports create jobs. It's less clear for some companies like Starbucks or in my neighborhood for the financial services sector, where there's a lot of disbelief that China's opening in this sector, allowing how many thousands of Starbucks are there now in China? Does that create jobs in Seattle? How does that affect kind of the state of Washington?
Well, certainly it creates jobs. It may not create, thousands and thousands of barista jobs in the state of Washington or the Seattle headquarters for Starbucks, because all those baristas are in China. But the design of those stores, the management, that's still all creating. Anytime you're building a huge multinational company like Starbucks, or whether it's, a Ford Motor Company or a huge pork producing facility, agricultural firm, you're creating jobs at the headquarters. You're creating all the people in the management and the financial services and all the accounting and related support functions in law and finance and everything else. So it does create jobs. It does create jobs. I mean, the more that our American companies can grow and sell their stuff and do business around the world, you're going to have more people here at the headquarters in America supervising, strategizing, designing, marketing, and things like that. And so that creates jobs. It creates jobs.
I don't mean to focus on Gary, but since you are the Chinese American governor on this call, talk about how our China policy has kind of reinforced kind of an increasing racism in the United States, and talk about what governors should be doing at the state level to combat that racism.
I may be Chinese American in terms of heritage, but I actually think Jon Huntsman is perhaps in many ways more Chinese than I am, because he's lived in China in Asia for so many years and speaks fluent Mandarin, and I actually speak grew up on kind of the peasant dialects of China and southern China. Let me just say that is one of the disconcerting and troubling aspects, I think, for any person concerned about civil rights and civil liberties and just human progress in America. We started in the 1800s or the mid 1800s, starting with the California gold rush. We had large immigrant groups coming from China, and then the laborers who actually completed the Transcontinental Railroad when it was stuck outside the mountains of California. It was the laborers from China with their knowledge of dynamite and explosives that really rescued that huge project. But there's been a lot of hostility toward Chinese Americans or Chinese, whether the Chinese Exclusion Act and later on laws that prohibited foreigners aimed primarily at Japanese and Chinese from owning land in the United States and certainly on the West Coast, to the internment of the Japanese during World War II, even though their sons volunteered and became the most famed decorated military unit in U.S. history, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Right now, we're seeing a backsliding in which all things Chinese are almost viewed as suspect. Chinese students are suspect. Chinese researchers are suspect, as Governor Snyder indicated. Chinese companies are suspect, whether it's in social media to even the assembly of subway cars or buses. You know, there's not much high tech in a bus, but I mean, I don't know, but people are afraid that buses made by a Chinese company, even though assembled in the United States with union American workers, are somehow going to spy on Americans, and the list goes on and on. And we've seen, of course, rhetoric from the administration saying this is the China virus, the Kung flu virus, the Wuhan virus, and that's really discouraging because we're seeing acts of violence and harassment toward not just Chinese Americans, but all Asian Americans. And that's most unfortunate. We really need, and I think that's where the governors can play a role, to stand up and say, hey, you know, we may have very specific and legitimate concerns about the policies coming from the Chinese government, but let's not tar all Chinese people with the same brush. We need leadership, moral leadership. And I want to say that when George W. Bush was president, right after the attack on the September 11th attack against the United States, in a cabinet meeting, he very forcefully said to the cabinet that we need to make sure that what happened to the Japanese Americans during World War II is not repeated in the aftermath of September 11th attack, that we cannot tar and feather all Muslim Americans for the acts of a few, and the way that we tarred and feathered and incarcerated all Japanese Americans, at least on the West Coast, for what happened in World War II.
Jon, you put in place, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, this phenomenal K-12 Chinese education program in the Utah schools. Every report, whether it's the report from Policy Planning in the State Department to the House Intelligence Committee, says we need more Chinese speakers in the United States, period. We need more people who understand China better, not only in the State Department, but in Commerce, Treasury, Homeland Security, Defense, you name it. Why has that initiative not been picked up by other states, or has it? And I'm just not aware of it.
You know, I haven't followed, Steve, the extent to which it's been picked up by others, but I suspect every state will have local politics to some extent that will make it difficult, particularly when it's Chinese language in today's challenging environment. But for me, I saw it as, how do you best prepare the next generation of young kids to perform on the world stage? Because it doesn't matter whether they get into business or they're academics or in the legal field or whatever it might be, they're going to encounter some aspect of China in whatever it is they do. You just can't have the United States and China on the world stage as you look at the decades to come without coming to the conclusion that we're going to run into each other, and there will be challenges stemming from that. There'll be huge opportunities as well. So what better way to equip young people to prepare for their future than giving them the gift of a language, which, you know, they may be conversant after, you know, they finish high school. That's not as important as the fact that it's through language study that they're able to, it's a lens through which they can view culture and better understand somebody else who they've never met. So we had kids, you know, it didn't matter whether they were urban or rural, rich or poor, black or white, they would line up to sign up for these language classes starting a decade ago, mostly because the parents saw the value in giving their young kids the added advantage of a strategically important language. And to my mind, it was one of the better investments we made on the public education side. And I explained it to the people of my state by simply saying, isn't knowledge of a language better than not having a knowledge of a language? And when these kids encounter their peers in China, most of them will be pretty fluent in English. So why should we want to put ourselves at a strategic disadvantage by not exposing ourselves? So I just think we feel the presence of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. These are the most impenetrable barriers any country has. And because of that, we don't have to venture out and learn new languages. But the reality is that the decades ahead are going to see the United States and China come face to face on a number of fronts. And the next generation will be so much better off in terms of their understanding and ability to communicate and reason with a country that we're going to have to forge some sort of meaningful relationship with, even during very difficult times such as today.
We have literally dozens of questions that have come in from the audience. So let me start getting to them. But before that, while I go through them, let me get to what John had suggested. What should the subnational level be doing? What should the governors of the 50 states be proposing with respect to China policy? Rick, you want to start with that, or you need to unmute though?
Yeah, I think we need to get started again, because again, I think we've reached a low point with this pandemic and the tariffs and everything else. I think we do have a new federal administration coming, so there's an opportunity to take a fresh start looking at these things and to build on positive relationships. So one of the things I tell people when they ask me about China is we don't tell enough of the positive stories about Chinese investment in the US, Chinese educational opportunities, the cultural exchanges. We tend to hear all the negatives. So one of the things from a subnational level is I think it would be great if we'd find more ways to talk about the success stories. The Chinese company here that now employs several hundred Michiganders or Utahns or people in Washington, and the livelihoods that are being created and how they're being positive, community members in terms of doing good things. And you just start building back that way. Because it's hard for people when you just talk about theory. It's easy to find people you dislike. When you actually engage real people and make it about personal relationships and positive success stories, that's where you can start overcoming a very negative bias, which I think we're going to have to deal with for some time.
Harry?
I think the governors have to take the lead, reestablishing trade missions, trying to help our companies sell their great made in USA and produced goods and services to China. We need to continue to welcome the establishment of Chinese companies in the United States, hiring our local people. And I hope that the incoming administration will focus on some projects of collaboration, just whether it's in cancer research or climate change, clean energy. We need some positive partnerships, some partnerships in areas that will help us reset the relationship.
Steve, one of the things that we could do is help link all of our elementary and secondary school students with elementary and secondary school students in China, so that they start learning the different cultures and the language and everything else as they grow up. Because our chance of convincing somebody that's 60, 70 years old to change their mind is going to be more difficult than opening the opportunity for a young person to learn about another culture.
John, you said you had a couple of suggestions you were holding back on. Now is the time.
I just can't overemphasize enough the importance of subnational dialogue, because where we have common ground between the United States and China isn't always Washington and Beijing, as we have seen in recent years. Zero common ground, zero ability to carry on any meaningful strategic dialogue. Where we have common ground is at the local level. And again, you get mayors together, you get governors together, they speak the same language. They're trying to find solutions and practical approaches for the same things. So if we're imagining how we can hold together this most important relationship, the most important in the world, and it will be for some time to come, it really is going to be incumbent on local officials and leaders to forge the kinds of ties organized by your group or maybe others that I think will do a couple of things. One, it will impart practical solutions from one country to another, where people have found new ways of doing things in education or healthcare, or how to manage big, complicated cities and municipalities. But second, I think it will also forge the kind of lasting relationship and bond that we're going to need country to country, that is based on real substance and real interaction and dialogue. It's way too ephemeral and iffy at the national level, because we just haven't found common cause or issues that we can begin to build any kind of meaningful dialogue around. So subnational, is really, I think, where the action is going to be going forward. And if everyone isn't convinced after listening to my colleagues here in terms of what they've been able to do on education, agriculture, trade, and so many other fronts. This is where we can be most productive, no question about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's leading me to, I think one of the most moving experiences I ever had in my life, not only as president of the National Committee, was going to an opening of an automotive plate glass company in Dayton, Ohio, 3 miles from where my brother lived. And they took over an abandoned General Motors facility. They put 2,500 Americans to work, and this thing was called Fuyao Glass. And I went there, and Governor Kasich was there, and Senator Brown was there, and Congressman Turner. It was this bipartisan support for what was this community recreation. I saw the community, which my brother, which I'd seen through his eyes, just deteriorate as it got hollowed out over 30 years to kind of being reborn. It was such a deeply moving experience. And the Chinese founder was not even a high school graduate, and that he had done this. It was, you kind of say, God, if that story could be replicated 50 times or 500 times, it really would make a difference, because certainly the people around Dayton understood what was going on. I know people were thinking of Trans-Pacific Partnership as opposed to a bilateral investment agreement, but somehow politically a bilateral investment agreement may be a little easier than TPP. Some audience questions. One from Mark Cohen at University of California and at Berkeley. Do you think, you guys have done you've all done trade missions, and this may be particularly good for Gary. Do you find our State Department supports, our Foreign Commercial Service supports these trade missions sufficiently, or is there more that should be done?
I think that both Commerce Department and State Department very much support the trade missions. They have economic units, certainly within the State Department, and both the embassies and the consulates in China will support delegations coming over from the United States and helping arrange the visits, the potential customers for Washington State or any of the companies and members of the delegations on any of these state visits. So they're very, very supportive, and we need to, in fact, any state and any trade organization or industrial sector of a state should insist that their governor's offices rely on and take advantage of the resources offered by the Commerce Department and the State Department in helping schedule these visits, but also to find potential customers and potential trading partners for our U.S. companies and entities.
Steve, I think they do a very much an adequate job. Larger corporations take advantage of them because they know how to use them better. The smaller companies and entrepreneurs probably are left out a little bit. But what concerns me is when we start revoking visas and shutting down consulates, it just restricts and reduces our reach. And I'm not just talking about diplomats, I'm talking about the business community. Because China's a complicated market, and generally businesses going in, they like to learn all they can. They like to consult with the Commerce Department staff, with the embassies and others. And that's a good thing to do. What I think we're going to see, and we've seen this already, and Governor Snyder and others probably have set the standard on this, is opening state trade offices. So states are becoming a lot more active on their own, almost creating their own trade promotion facility and staff that really does help local businesses, which I think is a good thing, and we're probably going to see a lot more of that, just given the size and complexity of the U.S. China commercial relationship.
Yeah, Steve, the part I would add is I found them to be very helpful in terms of the embassy people, both from Commerce and State, when we were on our trade missions. They were proactive, and I found it good intelligence. They would want to give us briefings, and to go to John's point, we would be taking delegations of smaller companies along with us to get them introduced. And so we'd build that tie. The part I always thought was kind of interesting is I never saw the State Department or the Commerce Department really on those things when it was back in Michigan. They were very good when we were in China or whatever country, but they didn't have any real engagement coming back the other direction, which in some ways you could argue they were spread thin, but you'd think that would also be an opportunity to have a touch point of a positive one. But they were largely absent from all that process. And in fact, to go to John's point, we have trade relationships and representatives in China and a number of other countries, but we set up a thing in Michigan. We set up the U.S. China Innovation Center in Michigan to be a welcome center for all Chinese activities within our state. And we were one of the very few states that actually made that investment. And we set it up in a fashion so it was quasi-governmental and would last between administrations. And it's been a big help.
I assume everyone on this call would support the reciprocal reopening of the consulates in Houston and in Chengdu. And expansion of kind of foreign commercial service representation, not only at the embassy in Beijing, but throughout China. Do I hear any dissent? No, I didn't expect any. Let's go back. A lot of questions have come in about Secretary Pompeo's speech at the National Governors Association. Were your successors affected by that speech? Did it change the way they were thinking about doing business with China? That comes from Mike Billington and Robert Wesser.
Not affect our governor. We know how important trade with China is in those relationships. China is our #1 export destination, at least up until the tariff war or the trade war. So we know how important trade with China and relations with China are to our economic success.
A question from Chris Merck, which requires us to speculate on the President-elect Biden. He has said he will move slowly and deliberately with respect to China. How should he start that process?
You know, Gary probably has as good a feel as anybody on this one, but let me just say, if you're starting a new relationship out of kind of a tattered past, you kind of got to look at your downside risk. You know, where are you most exposed? Let's just start with the basics before we build up the commercial and trade stuff. And that would be an unintended incident that were to happen in the air or on the high seas between our militaries without a proper de-escalation strategy. So once things escalate, as we saw with an incident roughly 20 years ago, it's really hard to put things back together again, even with hotlines and all of that. They sometimes don't work as they should. So the first order of business really is, how do we limit risk between the two of us and come up with some sort of proper communication protocol if, heaven forbid, there was an incident that had to be addressed. That, if I were going in as President-elect Biden, it seems to me that would be the first order of business, just to make sure that that risk is properly addressed and dealt with.
I think also it's very important for the incoming administration to form alliances with our allies around the world who also have concerns about China policy, and really start thinking about a more unified approach, multilateral approach, instead of a unilateral approach, because all of our allies, while they were urging us on and hoping we might win in this trade war, at least in terms of achieving the objectives that we sought, but they were not about to help us because they were actually benefiting from that trade war. So they were sitting on the sidelines benefiting, but rooting for us. We need to actually have them actively engaged.
An interesting, I guess I need to ask this, John, because it's for you, and it's from Bob Kapp. And like you and me and Bob, we're the parents of adopted children from China. As the relationship tanks, what are your thoughts on the impact of this darkening relationship on these adopted kids, some of whom are fully adults by now? And I guess I would add to that, is there some positive kind of role that they could play?
Well, they can be, and Bob is terrific. I've learned so much from Bob over the years in a number of different areas. But, I always talked to our daughter, Grace, you know, who is very mindful of the environment in which she's living. She's now a college junior, and very, very thoughtful and mindful of this tightening environment and the way that she is looked at and viewed. We've always taught her that she is a cultural bridge, and she should work as a cultural bridge. She should bring greater understanding to people. She should not forsake her home culture that gave her life, but rather seek to understand it and help Americans to better understand it as well. The great secret sauce in the United States, and Gary Locke and his family are a great example of this, is, you know, our ability as a country to assimilate diversity, to make it work, and for everyone to pull together around a common American theme. And that's where, you know, from time to time, we seem to find ourselves in a really tricky situation based on international tensions. And right now, China is a focal point. And I have conversation after conversation with my daughter about what it means. I think that helps. I think bringing greater awareness to young kids who have been adopted from China is important, but also stressing with them the helpful role that they can play through it all.
Yeah. Anybody on the call aware of kind of what's happening to Foxconn's investment in Wisconsin? That has kind of looked like it was going ahead, now may not be going ahead. Anybody following that?
Well, it appears it's just behind what the expectations are. I'm not sure to what degree, but it's not on the path that was originally presented.
Yeah, and it raises the whole question of kind of states providing enormous tax credits for foreign investment and competing with other states. Should there be a policy that kind of makes that, you know, one could argue that if you're giving a huge tax credit, the people of your state, even though you're measuring it and saying, well, it's benefiting enough to justify that tax credit, but then you're competing with your neighbor next door. Is that good policy or not?
Yeah, well, I was always on my soapbox on this one. We actually competed for Foxconn. To go to your comment, Steve, I know the chairman of Fuyo Glass because I talked to him about coming to Michigan. And they had that GM facility. I didn't have a ready-made facility for him to move into. Otherwise, I think we would have gotten him here. What I always tell people
he says his suppliers are in Michigan, though, so you guys did get a benefit.
is I think tax credits are relatively insane. And I think it's a bigger problem with U.S. governments than it is with any foreign government. To compete on that basis, it's just one of those realities. And when people say you should have a policy, well, you got 50 states. Someone's always going to come up to say how they can offer a better deal. So it's a very difficult thing to deal with in some contexts, short of something in the Internal Revenue Code to make it so it doesn't have value. I've always presented to, I've never tried to get people to come to our state solely based on tax credits. It's about the environment, the culture, the place to work, and how they can be successful long-term. Yep. And tax credits do get misused, both in terms of how much is given out by governments and how some companies take them and fail to live up to their commitments. So it's just something that I always say, buyer beware on both sides when you talk about tax credits.
I think these are issues that every governor has to wrestle with, and it depends on the sector, the industry. I mean, there are various parts of the United States that are more attractive, more conducive to certain types of industrial sectors than others. But each governor is going to have to justify whatever tax incentives, investment incentives they provide to a company, whether it's a foreign company, whether it's BMW or ThyssenKrupp, a German company setting up operations in a particular state, to Boeing, the big competition among the states for where the Boeing was going to build their 787, to even a foreign company, a Chinese company wanting to locate in the United States. Each state, each governor has to decide this on its own merits and whether or not it really pencils out. And whether or not, from a United States standpoint, it really doesn't matter. I mean, where a company locates, whether it's in Mississippi versus Florida versus Washington State, the benefits are going to be to the United States in general. And so it becomes a competition among the different states as to where that industry might locate. And you got to really figure out, is this really going to take away dollars long term from social services, from education, from healthcare, to even other industries? And so that's an individual decision.
Yeah. Let's touch a little more on education, because that's so critical at the state level. I mean, Governor Snyder's made reference to the reductions at Michigan State, University of Michigan. I'm sure it's true at University of Missouri, University of Washington, and University of Utah. So what are the long-term implications of this, and what do we do to fix it? What can a governor, obviously we'll call on President-elect Biden to fix visas, but is it fixable, or trust what's broken is impossible to kind of restore?
Well, once a decision like that is made, reversing a visa decision that Gary Locke and others worked so hard on, it becomes really difficult to put back in place. And I'll tell you why this should be a concern, because you won't find a Chinese student who has spent time in the United States without it having impacted them, without them caring forever what they learned, who they met, better understanding the United States. So this isn't just a master's or a PhD. This is a deeper understanding of the United States and its people. I mean, I look at the senior ranks of Chinese leadership right now, and I can tell you those few who had exposure to the United States, undergraduate and graduate. In fact, there's one who really leads most of their economic policy discussions, who was both undergraduate and graduate in the United States. And it's enormously beneficial in helping to understand a system that to most outside observers here in the United States is very complicated. Chinese leaders don't have a profoundly deep understanding of how our system works, but those who have taken the time to go to school here, be educated here, they have a huge advantage, and it works both ways. And so do Americans who have been to school in China. So we are, by narrowing the gap on visas, by making it more exclusionary and more difficult to travel back and forth, we're just doing ourselves enormous long-term damage, where we could be reaping the longer-term, deeper understanding of those who were able to take advantage of such programs.
Gary, did you want to comment? Then I'll go to my final question.
Well, it's, encouraging more visitors to each other's countries is in both of our political and economic self-interest. I mean, Tony Blair said many years ago that diplomacy first starts with people-to-people exchange. And the more Chinese are exposed to American democracy, our diversity, our history, our culture, and especially our freedoms. Certainly we have problems, but at least we openly admit those and confront them and try to address them compared to many other countries. But the more that the Chinese, and especially the students, can see how America operates and understand the secret sauce of our success, that entrepreneurialism, that rule of law, and constant innovation and protection of intellectual property, the more they're going to want that in their own countries. So I really think that we need to encourage more of that exchange, and certainly those international students, as Governor Snyder was indicated. I mean, they actually help subsidize the cost of education for our in-state students, because those international students actually pay more than the actual cost, by and large, than the actual cost of education. So they're helping subsidize the education for our in-state students, because legislatures have been actually cutting back on funding for all of our public education and raising tuition. And so the more that we can get outside dollars in, the more we're able to keep college more affordable for our in-state students.
Yeah. I had a student when I taught at Webster University, and at the end of the year, I'd always let them talk after I turned in their grades. And she was from China. And she got up and she said, "Governor, I will not go back to China the same person that came to America." Now, what better foreign policy promotion could you have than that opportunity? And I've worked for years with the American Legion Boy State and Girl State program, and we brought some Chinese students at high school student level coming over and participating. One year, one of those young ladies happened to get elected governor of Missouri Girls State. And then they found out she wasn't an American citizen. So the thing is, building this collaborative relationship between cultures at a young age benefits all of us.
Last question is about, President-elect Biden has talked about a values-led foreign policy, values-based foreign policy. Governors obviously are trying to create employment in their states and want to expand business ties with China and build bridges. The Chinese government is, over the last few years engaged in, we've already heard Governor Snyder refer to the national security law in Hong Kong. We've seen really incredible crackdowns in Xinjiang. We've seen increasing tightening vis-a-vis Tibet, vis-a-vis dissidents in China, vis-a-vis the lawyers for the dissidents in China. How should a governor think about kind of that aspect of China versus the job creation aspect of China in their home state? I'd end with a tough one.
Yeah, I would say, Steve, that governors carry American values wherever they go. It doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or Democrat. I mean, you carry the values of freedom and liberty, openness, transparency. All our First Amendment rights are on full display, when a governor is around, because you are kind of the walking embodiment of the American system. So I think that is helpful. Washington has a role to play, obviously, and they're going to have to deal with some of the thornier issues. But I really do, again, getting back to the subnational idea that kind of gave rise to all of this. So much of what we do in our system, so much of how we raise and educate our next generation, so much of our free market innovation is based on freedom. And it's on display at the state level, it's on display at the local level in ways that really does speak for itself. So why is it that China has tried to replicate so much of what we have done here, whether it's research universities or whether it's other aspects of economic and technology development? Because they have seen models that work. So our values are going to be in contention. We're going to see the world differently. We're not going to be able to solve a lot of our problems, nor should we expect to. But leaders at the local level, particularly governors, they really do, and all that they do as governor, carry with them the values of the United States.
Certainly, the governors can't ignore the concerns that we as Americans have about some of the human rights and issues occurring within China, or how China treats its people. We have to acknowledge it. We can't turn away from it. But at the same time, we can talk about how we in America try to address these issues. Just as John was saying, China is trying to emulate so much of what we do in America. And I think that the more whether it's students, whether it's business visitors, or government officials from China that might be here on a trade mission, looking at it for investment opportunities where they might be able to locate a factory or set up shop here in the United States. During those interactions with our local and state officials, we should have those discussions about how we are trying to address some of these very same issues, and how we openly confront them, how we try to learn from our mistakes, and how we're always trying to move forward. That's in huge contrast to what occurs in China, where everything is swept under the rug, where ethnic minorities really have little chance of reaching high positions in government or business or academia in China, and how women, almost very few women are in high roles in China. So we have much to be proud of, and even though we have problems, we should be proud of how we have tried to address them, and how much progress we have made on so many of these issues. And that can actually stand out in contrast to the way that China has approached it. So we shouldn't shirk away from these tough issues, and we can openly admit that we have similar issues, but we're trying to deal with it in a very transparent way and trying to move forward.
Rick?
I just reinforce that. It's important on any of these issues that we have to acknowledge differences that we have or things that are important to us. Just like I talked about intellectual property earlier and the trade things, that human rights are something that represents America. So you can't just assume it's all Pollyanna. It's important to put the issues on the table, but then say, how do we constructively keep moving forward in areas we can, while at the same time trying to increase understanding and the need to address some of these kind of things. Because these are tough issues that they have a fundamentally different perspective on than we do. And some of them we do have to work through. Some will work out more naturally, but the civil rights issue is a huge one that I think we're going to have to continue to have dialogue on it and figure out how to strike that right balance, as opposed to just simply pushing them away and closing the door. How do you keep the door open? How do you keep growing together and learning from one another so our point can be received in a more constructive way?
Bob? You're muted.
The more open we are, the better we are. The better situation gives us the opportunity to truly influence and change attitudes. You can't force it, but what you can do is open the door so people can see a better way to approach it. And I think that's the best way we can deal with China and the rest of the world.
I think I've run way over, which is unlike what the National Committee generally does. Are we allowed to go to 2 o'clock or 1:45?
2:45.
1:45. So I did run over. I wasn't 100% sure, but that's because I was absolutely entranced in this conversation. You know, I think it's people always are calling me these days and saying your life is really difficult because U.S. China relations are so difficult, and it must at times be depressing. And the truth of that is it is difficult, and at times it is depressing. But when I have a meeting like this, when I talk to 4 incredible public servants like who have been represented on this call, I'm fond of saying, you know, my heart soars like an eagle, and as he said, that little big man. But it's so impressive. You guys have been terrific. I think this has been a wonderful, informative program. I'm happy that you've been governors, and I hope that you continue to play a role not only in your state, but at the national level, because your thoughts and your views are so incredibly valuable. But thank you for giving so generously of your time, and thank Bob for helping Governor Holden for helping put this together with the U.S. China Heartland Association.